The first clue was not the dead pump. It was my electric bill. For 3 straight months, the power use at my well house climbed by nearly 40%. My wife and I had not changed anything. We had not added livestock. We had not filled a pool. We had not started watering crops. Yet the pump was cycling so often that I could hear it kick on from the kitchen window. Then, one hot afternoon in August, it failed completely. The technician pulled the old pump, checked the motor, and looked at me with the kind of expression you never want to see from someone who has worked on rural wells for 25 years. This pump wasn't worn out, he said. It was overworked. He checked the pressure tank, followed the buried supply line toward my house, and stopped 52 feet from the well casing, under a patch of tall grass beside my north fence. Somebody had cut into my water line and installed a second pipe. That pipe crossed under the fence. It ran straight toward my neighbor's horse barn. By the time I proved how much water had left my property without permission, the number was over 41,000 gallons, and my neighbor had already decided I should not make a fuss because, in his words, "You've got plenty." If you enjoy property stories where documentation beats excuses, subscribe to HOA Reality Stories. And tell me this, if a neighbor quietly used your water, electricity, or land for months, would you try to settle it privately first, or call the authorities right away? My name is Grant Holloway, and my wife, Leslie, and I have lived outside Cedar Hollow for 21 years. Our place is a little over 6 acres. The house sits near the road, with a red equipment shed behind it, 2 acres of pasture to the west, and a low patch of woods that turns gold every October. We raised our daughter there. We buried 2 old dogs there. We learned the hard way which corner of the driveway turns to mud after a hard spring rain. It is not a fancy property, but it is ours, and we have built our life around knowing how every part of it works. The well was part of that life. It had been drilled in 2001, 3 years before we bought the place. It was 186 feet deep, clean, dependable, and strong enough to deliver about 16 gallons a minute when everything was running normally. For rural people, a good well is not just a utility. It is security. It feeds the kitchen, the showers, the washing machine, the garden spigot, and the small livestock trough we kept when our daughter showed sheep in 4-H. We had the water tested regularly. We kept the pump serviced. We knew the pressure tank sounds well enough to notice if a cycle lasted a few seconds too long. The system had needed one major repair in 2 decades. That was it. So when the pump started running more often in early summer, I noticed. I did not panic at first. Pumps cycle more in hot weather. We had a dry July. Leslie was watering the flower beds. I had reseeded part of the pasture. It was possible we were simply using more water than usual, but the numbers did not feel right. Our household normally used somewhere between 80 and 95 gallons a day. That was based on years of pump records, our pressure tank service notes, and a temporary meter I had installed after a leak scare years ago. In June, the estimated daily use rose to 167 gallons. In July, it rose above 200. By the first week of August, our well pump was drawing enough water to serve a small household and a barn. We did not have a barn. The neighbors directly north of us did. Dale Rucker had bought that property about 5 years earlier. He was a retired truck mechanic with 3/4 horses, 2 rescue goats, and a weathered metal barn that had seen better days. Dale was not a stranger. We waved when we passed each other on County Road 8. He had lent me a post-hole auger one spring when mine broke halfway through a fencing job. I had helped him pull a stalled utility trailer out of a wet field the following winter. We were not close friends, but we were the kind of neighbors who should have been able to talk honestly if something went wrong. Dale's property had an old well near the barn. I knew that much because I had seen the well casing when he first moved in. I did not know its condition. I did not know whether it still produced enough water for his animals, and I certainly did not know that, beneath a strip of grass between our properties, someone had joined his water needs to my private well, The pump failed on a Tuesday. I had just come back from town when I heard the pressure tank trying to cycle without building pressure. The house water slowed to a trickle. 10 minutes later, it stopped entirely. I called Mason Well Service, the company that had replaced our pressure switch years earlier. Their technician, Derek, arrived the next morning. Derek had gray hair, sunburned forearms, and the steady manner of a man who had seen every possible way people can neglect a water system. He tested the electrical controls first. Then he pulled the pump assembly. The motor had overheated, not catastrophically, but enough that it needed replacement. He checked the pump housing, laid his flashlight against the pipe trench, and said, "This should have lasted longer than it did." I asked what could cause it to wear out early. "Too much draw," he said. "A leak can do it. A bad pressure setting can do it. Or you've got a whole lot more water leaving this line than you think." Then he started walking the route from the well house to our pressure tank. He stopped near the north fence. At first, I saw nothing but uneven grass. Then he knelt down, pulled aside a clump of weeds, and found a small access box half buried in the dirt. Inside was a T-joint fitted into the main water line. One side went to my house. The other fed a newer black pipe that turned toward Dale's land. Derek looked up at me. "Did you put this in?" "No." "Did the previous owner?" "No." He ran his hand along the black pipe until it disappeared under the fence line. "This isn't original," he said, "and it wasn't installed by an amateur. The connection had shut-off valves. The fittings were sealed properly. The pipe was buried deep enough to avoid a casual glance, but not deep enough to be invisible to somebody who knew where to look. Someone had spent time and money making sure the line would work. They had just not spent 1 minute asking me." Derek replaced the well pump that afternoon. The invoice came to $1. $684. I paid it because we needed water back in the house. But before he left, I asked him to close the valve feeding the unauthorized line. He did. Then I watched him mark the location with orange survey paint. For the first time in weeks, the pump stopped cycling every few minutes. The silence was almost unsettling. Derek told me not to dig up the line myself. He said that if I believed someone had tapped into my supply, I should document it before removing anything. A clean record mattered more than a quick confrontation. That made sense to me. I had no interest in a shouting match at a fence line based only on suspicion. The pipe pointed toward Dale's barn, but a pipe was not the full story. I needed to know when it had been installed, how far it went, and whether there was any legitimate agreement attached to it. There was not. The next Friday, I hired a utility locating company from the next county over. The technician used a tracer system to follow the line from the T-joint through my side of the property. The report showed a 3/4-inch polyethylene pipe leaving my main supply, crossing the north boundary, and continuing toward Dale's barn. The locator could not enter Dale's property without consent. He did not need to. The line originated at my well. The recorded boundary was clear, and the pipe's direction left no mystery about who was benefiting from it. That report cost me $340. After that, I pulled every document I had on our well. The original drilling record, the pump replacement records, the county inspection paperwork, the property survey. There was no shared water agreement, no easement, no utility right-of-way, no notation allowing another property to draw from my system. Then I contacted the county environmental health office. In our county, private well modifications are supposed to be recorded when they affect a water system or cross a property boundary. I requested the file for Dale's address, partly because I wanted to be fair and partly because I wanted facts before I spoke to him. The clerk called me back 3 days later. Dale's old well had been permanently abandoned 14 months earlier. The county had a closure permit on file. The casing had been sealed because the water level had become unreliable and the system had failed a bacteria test after a flood season. 14 months. That timeline lined up almost perfectly with the first unexplained increase in our pump activity. I sat in my truck outside the county office with that information in my hands and did the math. 3 horses can drink 30 to 45 gallons of water a day, depending on weather and workload. Add 2 goats, barn cleanup, trough refills, and warm weather washdowns, and the numbers climbed quickly. Even using conservative estimates, Dale could have been drawing more than 100 gallons a day from my well. Over 14 months, that came to tens of thousands of gallons, and our pump had been carrying the entire load. I did not call a lawyer first. I did not call the sheriff. I drove to Dale's barn. He was standing by the far stall when I pulled up. Filling a feed bucket, he saw my truck and gave me the same small wave he always gave me. For a moment, I wished I could wave back and let the whole thing be a misunderstanding. Then I looked past him. Mounted near the rear wall of the barn was a new automatic trough system. And running into the side of that system, clean and black against the dusty metal wall, was a water pipe that had no business being there. I stepped out of the truck with the locator report folded in my hand. Dale looked at my face. His wave disappeared. He already knew why I was there. Dale set the feed bucket down slowly. "What did you find?" he asked. I did not accuse him right away. I handed him the locator report and told him exactly what Derek had discovered at my well house. A T-joint added to my private water line, a pipe buried under the fence, and a line that ended at his barn. Then I told him about the county record. His old well had been closed 14 months earlier. Dale read the report without saying much. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might deny it. He didn't. Instead, he looked toward the trough system and said, "I didn't think it would be a big deal." That answer landed harder than a denial would have. I asked him when the line had been installed. He said the old well had stopped keeping up during a dry spell. His plumber had told him that a new well could cost somewhere between $9,000 and $12,000, depending on drilling depth. Dale said he had been living on retirement income. The horses needed water every day, and he had not known what else to do. "So you connected to mine." I said, "I knew you had a strong well. You knew it was mine." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I was going to talk to you. But you didn't." He looked irritated then, because the truth had left him nowhere useful to stand. "Grant, you weren't using all that water. You and Leslie have a good system. I wasn't hurting anybody." I took a breath before I answered. "My pump just burned out almost 3 years early." He said nothing. "It cost me $1, $684 to replace. Your animals were pulling water from a system I maintain, pay electricity for, and test every year. You didn't ask. You didn't offer to pay. And you buried the line under my fence." Dale's face tightened. "I didn't bury it. The plumber did. That does not make it less connected to my well." He looked toward the barn again. The horses were standing quietly in their stalls. None of this was their fault. They needed water. I understood that. I had raised animals myself. But a person's difficult situation does not turn a neighbor's property into a free utility. I told Dale I wanted the connection permanently disconnected. I wanted his water system separated from mine. And I wanted him to send me a written plan within 10 days explaining how he intended to handle his own supply. He said 10 days was not enough. I said, 10 days is enough to decide whether you are going to solve your problem honestly. Then he gave me the sentence that made the next step unavoidable. "You're really going to make a neighbor drill a well when you've got water to spare?" I looked at him. "No. You made yourself responsible for a well the day you used mine without permission." The following Monday, I sent a certified letter. It was clear, calm, and specific. The letter included the locator report, photographs of the unauthorized connection on my property, the county records for Dale's abandoned well, and my pump invoice. I gave him 30 days to have the line removed by a licensed plumber and to provide proof that the connection had been permanently capped. I also told him I would seek reimbursement for the costs caused by the unauthorized use. Dale signed for the letter. Then he ignored it. No plan. No plumber. No written reply. 30 days passed with the valve on my side still closed. And I knew exactly what he was hoping for. He hoped I would get tired of the awkwardness. He hoped I would feel guilty about the horses. He hoped I would reopen the valve just to make the conflict disappear. but I had already paid for one pump I should not have needed to replace. I was not going to pay for the next one too. Before I took any formal action, I had a digital flow meter installed on my main well line. It cost $235. Including the fittings, the meter tracked every gallon leaving my well house for 21 days. With Dale's unauthorized branch valve closed, Leslie and I used an average of 87 gallons a day. That was normal. It confirmed what Derek had suspected from the beginning. Our own household had never caused the pump to run at the level that burned it out. Then I filed a complaint with the County Environmental Health Division. I did not claim Dale had stolen water in some dramatic criminal sense. I reported a documented cross-connection between private water systems with no recorded agreement, no easement, and no permit. I attached everything: my well records, the utility locator map, the repair invoice, the county closure record for Dale's old well, the certified letter and proof of delivery. The inspector arrived 16 business days later. His name was Martin Hale. He inspected the T-joint on my property first. Then he contacted Dale and requested access to his barn. Dale had no choice but to allow the inspection. The line ran exactly where we knew it ran, from my buried pipe, under the fence, into the rear of Dale's barn, then into an automatic trough system that served the horses and a washdown faucet used for the stalls. It was professionally installed, it was functioning, and it was completely unauthorized. Martin issued a written violation notice requiring Dale to disconnect the line within 30 days and submit confirmation from a licensed plumber. The county assessed a $900 civil penalty for the unpermitted cross-connection and the improper use of an unapproved water supply. Dale called me that night. For the first time, he did not sound defensive. He sounded tired. "I'll get it removed," he said. "That is what the county has ordered." I told him, "I need time to figure out water for the horses. I understand that, but you need to arrange it without using my system." He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What about the money you say I owe?" That was where I had tried to be fair. I hired an attorney to draft a demand letter, but I did not ask for inflated damages. I asked for the documented cost of the pump replacement, $1.684. I included the utility locator invoice, $340. I included the flow meter installation, $235. For the water itself, I used a conservative rate based on the county's agricultural bulk water schedule. The estimated unauthorized draw was 41,200 gallons. At 0,700 per gallon, the water use charge came to $288. Seizure. The total demand was $2. 547. Seizure. It was not revenge. It was the cost of fixing, documenting, and recovering from a problem Dale had created. The attorney gave him 30 days to pay. Dale did not answer immediately. But the county notice had changed the situation. He could no longer pretend the connection was an informal favor. The line had to come out. The fine had to be paid. And if he ignored the order, the county could escalate enforcement. 11 days later, a plumbing truck arrived at his barn. The crew removed the branch line, capped the penetration near the fence, disconnected the automatic trough system, and provided both Dale and the county with photographs and a signed completion statement. For the next several weeks, Dale had water delivered to his property in portable tanks. The delivery truck came twice a week. That was expensive, but it was legal. Dale paid my demand on the 29th day. The check arrived in a plain envelope with no note inside. yuan, 547. Seizure. The county fine was separate. So were the delivery charges for his livestock water. And so was the new well he eventually had drilled before winter. I never asked him what that well cost. I did not need to. A contractor working nearby told me the drill rig had gone more than 240 feet before finding a stable yield. Between drilling, casing, pump equipment, testing, electrical work, and trenching to the barn, Dale likely spent somewhere around $11. Ling ling ling. That was the cost he said he could not afford when I first confronted him. And I understood why he had panicked. A new well is expensive. Rural repairs do not wait for convenient times. Horses cannot go without water because an owner's finances are tight. But there was another option. He could have knocked on my door. He could have explained what happened to his old well. He could have asked for temporary help. We could have written an agreement, set a monthly rate, measured the water, and made sure my pump could handle the additional draw. I might have said yes. I probably would have, but Dale made that choice for both of us when he buried a pipe under my fence. A month after his new well became operational, the county closed the violation file. My system was sealed properly. The unauthorized T-joint was removed. The meter stayed in place, and I still check it once a week. Our usage settled back into its normal range. 84 gallons one day, 91 the next. Nothing mysterious. Nothing hidden. The new pump runs quietly now. It cycles when it should. The pressure stays steady. Leslie waters her flowers without listening for the well house to kick on every 10 minutes. Dale and I still see each other on County Road 8. We wave. It is not the same wave as before. It is shorter, more careful. But I do not hate him. Out here, holding a grudge can become its own kind of burden. You see the same people at the feed store, the gas station, the post office, and the town diner. You can spend years making every encounter miserable. Or you can protect your boundaries and keep moving. I chose the second one. Dale needed water for his animals. I needed my well to belong to me. Those two facts were never in conflict until he decided that my resources were his solution. He thought I had more water than I needed. Maybe I did. But having something extra does not mean somebody else gets to take it. If a neighbor secretly tapped into your private well, would you charge them for every gallon, or would you cut the line and let the county handle the rest? Share your answer below. And subscribe to HOA Reality Stories for more property disputes where calm evidence wins. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life property conflict themes. Names, characters, and specific locations have been changed or fictionalized. Visuals are generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only. The first time I understood what my neighbor had been doing, a man from Arizona was standing in the alley behind my building, staring at an empty space where his SUV had been 10 minutes earlier. He had 2 suitcases beside him, a toddler asleep against his wife's shoulder, and a towing receipt in his hand for $186. My host told us to park here, he said. He said it was private guest parking. I looked over at the sign mounted beside the entrance. Private lot, 214 Beacon Street. Permit holders only. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed. My name was printed under the last line. Then I looked past him, toward the renovated townhouse, 3 doors down, where his Airbnb host was collecting more than $200 a night for a place that came with an amenity he didn't own. I felt bad for that family. They were strangers in a city they didn't know, following instructions they had paid to receive. But I didn't feel bad for Owen Kessler, because Owen had not made one harmless mistake. He had been directing weekend guests into my private lot for months, telling them how to unhook my security cable, and warning them not to mention it to me. By the end of that summer, his free parking had become the most expensive lie in his rental listing. If you enjoy property stories where evidence does the talking, subscribe to HOA Reality Stories. And tell me in the comments, if somebody offered your property to paying customers without permission, how long would you wait before stepping in? Owen stepped onto the front porch and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. "What's going on?" he asked. I held out the screenshot from his guest instructions. "What's going on?" I said. "Is that you've been directing people to park in my lot?" He looked down at the page. His expression barely changed. Then he handed it back. "That's not exactly what it says." I told him it said plenty. It told guests where my lot was. It told them how to unclip my cable. It described the lot as a convenient place to park. And it specifically told them not to discuss the arrangement with nearby residents. Owen leaned against the porch railing. "Danielle, those spaces are empty most weekends." I said, "That doesn't make them yours." He gave a small laugh. The kind people use when they want a reasonable statement to sound unreasonable. I'm not taking anything from you. My guests are parked there for a couple of days. You still have your building. Your tenants still have their spaces. Nobody's getting hurt. That was the first moment I realized he had built an entire argument around the idea that an unused thing was an unowned thing. I opened my folder and showed him the camera stills. 19 vehicles. Dates. Arrival times. Drivers entering through my lot and walking directly toward his rental. Then I showed him a close-up photograph of the broken concrete edge near the drain. One of your guests damaged that last weekend. I said, Mallory has been blocked from leaving for work twice. Teresa has lost time with clients. This ends now. Owen looked through the photographs more carefully that time. For a second, I thought he might understand. Then he said, You're making a huge deal out of parking. No. I told him, You made a business decision involving property you don't own. I'm giving you a chance to correct it before this becomes more expensive for everybody. His eyes narrowed at that. What exactly are you asking for? Remove every reference to private parking from your listing, your guest guide, and your automated messages. Send a correction to any active booking with check-in dates after today. And tell your guests not to enter my lot. He folded his arms. That's going to hurt my bookings. I said, That is not my problem. He stared at me for a moment, then shook his head. You know, I'm bringing customers into this neighborhood. Those guests buy coffee here. They eat here. They're good for the area. I almost smiled at that. Teresa had been paying rent and taxes on Beacon Street since before Owen ever heard of it. Mallory worked overnight shifts at the hospital 2 miles away. I had spent 16 years keeping that building alive when the whole block was still struggling. But Owen had apparently decided that putting a few tourists in a renovated townhouse made him the benefactor of the neighborhood. I'm not asking you to close your rental. I said, I'm telling you to stop offering my lot as part of it. He looked past me toward the alley. Why don't we just make an informal arrangement? I can tell guests to be careful. I can make sure nobody blocks your tenants. There will be no informal arrangement. Then what? You're going to sue me over a few parking spots? I had expected that question. No. I said, I'm not going to spend a year in court and $15,000 in legal fees to prove something written on a sign. I'm going to protect my property. But before I do, I'm giving you 10 days to fix this. Owen's expression hardened. 10 days is ridiculous. It's enough time to edit a listing. What if I don't? I looked directly at him. Then every guest you send into my lot after today will be treated exactly like every other unauthorized vehicle. He nodded slowly, but it was not agreement. It was defiance. Fine, he said. Send your little letter. So I did. The following Monday, I mailed a certified cease and desist notice to Owen's townhouse and to the LLC listed on his rental license. I attached the screenshots, a summary of the camera footage, photographs of the signs, and a copy of the county parcel map showing the lot belonged to my building. The letter gave him 10 calendar days to remove the false parking information and confirm in writing that he had instructed all future guests not to enter my property. It also stated that I would enforce the posted towing policy against every unauthorized vehicle without further notice. Owen signed for the letter 2 days later. I know because the return receipt came back to me in the mail. Then I waited. On day 3, I checked his listing. The parking language was still there. On day 6, Mallory texted me a screenshot from her phone. A guest vehicle had pulled into my lot at 11:47 p.m. The driver had unhooked the cable and parked in my space. On day 8, I checked the listing again. Convenient private parking available nearby. Still there. On day 11, I stopped waiting. The city compliance officer called me 8 business days after I filed my report. Her name was Renee Wallace. She did not make promises, and I appreciated that. She told me the city would not decide a private property dispute for me. That was not her job. But the short-term rental office could investigate whether a licensed host was repeatedly giving guests instructions that created parking violations, access problems, or neighborhood complaints. I told her I understood. Then she asked whether I could send the original screenshots instead of printed copies. I did. I sent the guest instructions, the date-stamped footage, photographs of the signs, records of the tow authorizations, Mallory's written statement about being blocked before an ICU shift, and Teresa's note about losing a client appointment. Renee said an inspector would contact Owen and review the property within the next 2 weeks. That same afternoon, I received an email from Airbnb. It was short and carefully worded. They confirmed receipt of my report and said they were reviewing the listing for inaccurate amenity information and guest safety concerns. They did not tell me what action they would take. They did not have to. 2 days later, Owen's listing disappeared from the search results. I knew because I checked from a private browser window twice a day. At first, I thought he had simply paused it himself. Then Mallory found a local Facebook post from a woman asking why her Beacon Loft reservation had been canceled with less than 2 weeks' notice. She did not name Owen directly, but the listing photo was unmistakable. Charcoal gray exterior, rooftop string lights, same kitchen photographs. Another person commented that they had also received a cancellation notice. By the end of the week, 3 more people had asked about it. Owen's Airbnb was gone for 11 days. I did not celebrate. That is probably not what people expect me to say. They hear neighbor gets caught and imagine I was sitting in my office refreshing the page with a grin on my face. I wasn't. I wanted the parking instructions to stop. That was it. If Owen had corrected the listing after our first conversation, none of the rest would have happened. His guests would have parked on the street or in the city garage. My tenants would have had access to their spaces. I would have spent my weekends doing anything besides reviewing camera footage. But Owen had decided that my patience meant he could keep using my lot. Now the consequences were moving through systems he could not control with one smug conversation on his porch. The city inspector visited his townhouse the following Thursday. I did not watch from my window. I had work to do, and I was tired of spending energy on a problem Owen had created. But Owen showed up at my building that evening. He came through the alley instead of the front entrance, which told me he did not want Teresa or Mallory to see him. I was locking up my office when he knocked on the rear door. "Can we talk?" he asked. I let him in. He looked different from the man who had stood on his porch 2 weeks earlier. His shirt was wrinkled. His face was tired. He kept glancing at the blue folder on my desk, as if he expected it to open itself and start talking. "The city gave me a compliance notice," he said. I nodded. "They said I have 30 days to submit a corrected guest parking plan." "That sounds reasonable." Owen exhaled through his nose. "They also told me that if I keep getting complaints, they can suspend my rental license." I said nothing. He looked at me for a moment. Airbnb took my listing offline. I noticed I had 4 upcoming reservations. People are asking for refunds. "I'm sorry your guests are dealing with that." He stared at me. "You're sorry?" "I am. They did nothing wrong." That seemed to irritate him more than if I had argued. He pulled out his phone and set it on my desk. The screen showed a message from a guest requesting reimbursement for towing costs. Another message said the guest felt misled. A third said they had booked the house specifically because it advertised parking. "I can't afford for this to keep happening," Owen said. I looked at him calmly. "Then stop sending people to my lot." He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said the words I'd expected from the beginning. "What if I paid you?" I leaned back in my chair. "For what?" "To use the spaces officially." There it was. The arrangement he should have asked for before he ever listed the townhouse. I told him I would consider it, but it would not be a handshake agreement. If he wanted to use my property for his rental business, it would require a written parking license. He would have to provide his booking calendar in advance. He would be responsible for guest conduct, property damage, and any vehicle that overstayed. He nodded quickly. "Fine. Whatever paperwork you need." I opened a blank document on my computer and started listing terms. 2 spaces maximum. No access to Mallory's space, Teresa's space, or my reserved space, unless I authorized it in writing. Guests had to display temporary permits. No vehicles over a specified size. No overnight parking without a registered booking. No tailgating through the cable entrance. No garbage. No blocking the alley. No exceptions. Then I came to the rate. Owen looked confident right up until that point. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I told him the rate would be $75 per space. Per night. With a 2-night minimum for weekend reservations. His eyebrows lifted. $75 a night? Yes. That's insane. No. I said, it is private. Secure. Off-street parking in a district where your guests have already proven they will pay more for convenience. He shook his head. My guests won't pay that. They do not have to. You can build it into your rate. Offer it as an add-on. Or tell them to use the city garage. You're trying to make money off my problem. I looked at him. Owen, you made money off my property for months. I'm offering you a legal way to do business. You are free to decline. He did decline. Not in those words. Exactly. He said he needed time to think. He said he could not agree to that number. He said he would look into other options. Then he left. His other options were street parking and the city garage 3 blocks away. The same options he should have offered his guests from the start. Over the next month, Owen's rental came back online with a revised listing. The phrase, private parking available nearby, was gone for good. The guest guide no longer mentioned the alley, the cable, or the lot behind my building. It told visitors to use the municipal garage, where overnight parking costs $22 per night, or find legal street parking when available. The city closed its investigation after Owen submitted the corrected parking plan and agreed to keep a local contact number available for guest complaints. He received an administrative warning and had to complete a compliance review before the city restored his good standing. Airbnb restored his listing too. But the reviews did not disappear. The Arizona family's review stayed. So did another from a couple whose car had been towed after following Owen's instructions. Then there were the guests whose reservations had been canceled while his listing was under review. None of them used angry language. Nobody needed to. They simply described what happened. Parking was not as advertised. Host directions were confusing. Reservation was canceled unexpectedly. The city garage was farther away than expected. That is the thing about a public review record. You cannot argue with it on a porch. You cannot dismiss it as somebody being sensitive. It sits there, right beside the photos you paid for, warning future customers to look more closely. Owen did not lose his townhouse. He did not go out of business. He still rents it, although not nearly as often as he did before. His weekend price dropped from $229 to $179 for a while. His ratings recovered slowly, but not completely, and his guests now arrive with clear instructions about where they can and cannot park. As for my lot, it became quiet again. Mallory comes and goes without waiting for strangers to move their cars. Teresa's clients have access to her space. The cable stays secured, the signs are bright, and my camera alerts have become boring, which is exactly how I like them. A few months after everything settled, I saw Owen in the alley. He was carrying a grocery bag to his townhouse. He nodded at me, and I nodded back. New argument. No apology. Just 2 neighbors standing near a parking lot with very clear boundaries. Maybe he still thinks I overreacted. That is his right. But I know this. He had every opportunity to correct the problem before it cost him cancellations, complaints, towing reimbursements, compliance meetings, and a reputation he had worked hard to build. All he had to do was stop selling something that was never his. I did not ruin his rental. I simply made sure my parking lot was no longer part of it. Some people think ownership only matters when there is a fence around it. Owen learned that a posted sign, a recorded deed, and a property owner who pays attention can be just as solid. If someone used your property as a free amenity for their business, would you offer them a paid agreement or would you shut it down completely? Leave your take in the comments. And subscribe to HOA Reality Stories for more property battles where facts, records, and patience win. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life HOA and property conflict themes. Names, characters, and specific locations have been changed or fictionalized. Visuals are generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only.